Welcome and thank you for joining us today for this very significant discussion on girls' protection, protecting children in Afghanistan and prioritizing actions with girls. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. I'd like to warmly welcome and thank our speakers and those who are in the audience tonight. We have two amazing speakers today joining us from London and Geneva. I should also mention my name. I'm Bina DiCosta. I'm a professor at the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific, currently working from Athens, Greece. So like me, the other two speakers are also in Europe, and for them, actually, it's very early in the morning. So thank you, Ferishta Abbasi and Nicole Van Hooven. Ferishta joins us from London. Ferishta graduated with an LLB in Law and Political Science from Herat University and a law degree and a degree in Strategic Studies from the University of Aberdeen. Ferishta is an accomplished human rights campaigner, and she's also a vocal advocate for human rights and children's rights. She has highlighted human rights abuses in Afghanistan for several years, especially as a researcher for Human Rights Watch. Nicole Van Hooven is a protection program manager for Asia and the Pacific for the International Committee of the Red Cross. Nicole is joining us for Geneva. Very special thanks to Nicole for stepping in the last minute to replace our other colleague, protection advisor, Peter Winnie, who is unfortunately unwell. Nicole, with over 16 years of experience at the ICRC, worked in various contexts, including Zimbabwe, Colombia, Afghanistan, Jordan, and Gaza. Now at the ICRC headquarters in Geneva, Nicole oversees protection work in the Asia-Pacific region. She has a degree in human geography from the University of Amsterdam and has experience in protection training, as well as working with internally displaced people on sexual and gender-based violence and on community protection. Welcome, Ferishta and Nicole. You might have seen for our panel, we had a third speaker, Ferishta Karimi, who works and leads a local NGO in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Ferishta cannot join us today for other urgent issues, but we wish her and her organization the best of luck. So today is our second event commemorating the International 16 Days of Activism and Violence Against Women campaign, recognizing that girls and children experience very specific, age-responsive and gender-sensitive issues and concerns. We have separated this year's events with ICRC in two parts. My collaborator, Farkhonda Akbari, she led the session on women's rights. And today we are going to take a deep dive in the issues of children and particularly girls' protection issues and human rights concerns in Afghanistan. As we know, in Afghanistan, economic lifelines have been severed since mid-August, following the Taliban takeover after American and allied forces departed. In my work, prior to also working at the ANU and after that with UNICEF and Department of Peacekeeping in the UN, I've done some research and fieldwork in Afghanistan. So from that, we also know that millions of children, not only previously, but also now, they continue to need essential services, including primary health care, life-saving vaccines against polio and measles, nutrition, education, protection, shelter, water, and sanitation. These are some of the key concerns. At least 45% of the Afghan population is below the age of 15, and the international community must not abandon the children of Afghanistan. In solidarity with the children of Afghanistan who are bearing the brunt of rapidly escalating humanitarian crisis, this year, for example, UNICEF, during the World Children's Day on 20th of November, it didn't celebrate the event. It did this blackwashing of the online panels and all the digital space. Some of you might know that on November 20, UNICEF typically goes blue for children all over the world. This year in Afghanistan, UNICEF chose to close its digital channels, going dark, to reflect the challenges that children are facing in the country. After a dry winter and a weak harvest, drought, and food insecurity, there are lots of child protection issues and human rights concerns. Today, we'll hear from Fereshta and Nicole some of these issues firsthand. My first question is going to be to Fereshta. We know that human rights defenders are particularly concerned regarding the rights of girls, including sexual and gender-based violence, as well as their rights to education. Fereshta, could you please explain to us what are the key human rights issues for children, and in particular for girls in Afghanistan? Over to you, Fereshta.
Thank you very much, Bina. So I would like to give a very general overview of the situation and how it looks like, especially for women and girls in Afghanistan. Taliban took over the country on 15th August, and since then they have been in effective control of the whole Afghanistan. We have the experience of their government back in 1990s, and we know that they are not serious about protecting or respecting human rights at all. And we had these concerns from the very first few days that they took over the country. One of the questions that was really hitting the international community on the first few days was that whether if the Taliban have changed or not. And the simple answer is no, because in the past 3 months, they have proved and they have demonstrated that they don't want to respect human rights, or the human rights is not on their agenda at all. So I would say one of the top human rights concern at the moment in Afghanistan is that the country is at the edge of a humanitarian crisis. The food insecurity is very, very serious. I have been talking to people all over the country. I have recently talked to people on the south of Afghanistan. And one of the things that really saddens me is that the international community does not understand this urgency. So even if the international community start dispatching food to Afghanistan right now, it's going to be late. Afghanistan has very strong winters. The transportation means and the transportation routes and everything is not as accessible as it's expected there. So we are really expecting a disaster this winter in Afghanistan, and we have been trying to advocate for this, and we are trying to send this message from the local people out to the international community to say that try to find ways to dispatch food to Afghanistan from ways to make sure that the money is not going to the Taliban authority, actually. So this is one of the top concerns at the moment there. And with the Human Rights Watch, this is one of the things that I have been really following closely for the past 2 months at least. Although the access to information in Afghanistan has become very limited since August, it's very difficult to talk to people because they fear of their own safety. So it's very difficult to talk to people and to hear their concerns. But as far as we have researched and as far as we have heard from the local people, people are skipping their meals. And we have had reports that people are selling their kids, actually, especially the girls. That's one of the other concerns that the human rights community has at the moment is especially for the girls, is forced marriage. And it has I mean, it has different reasons. First of all, because of the food insecurity, people prefer to sell one of their kids to be able to afford the expenses for the other kids. And the second thing is that because there have been put a lot of restrictions on women's rights, especially on the freedom of movement, on the restrictions on the employment. In the southern and eastern provinces of Afghanistan, the Taliban have required women to go out with a male chaperone. One of the conditions that they have put on the female employees, especially in the healthcare and education sector, is to be accompanied by a mahram, to be accompanied by a male blood-related family member. And that's one of the other things that nowadays the girls have been forced to get married if they want to have a public life, a minimum public life or a minimum public presence. So in terms of the concerns with regards, especially for the girls, the case of, as I have talked to the healthcare workers in different parts of Afghanistan, the case of malnutritions are increasing every day, and with this, the economy is about to collapse. The banking system will be, according to the reports, will collapse in the next 3 months, and according to the UN reports, by 2022, 97% of the Afghan population will go under the poverty line. So, and this will result in more child labor, because people will then they will send the kids to the job market. Access to the healthcare is one of the other concerns that we have at the moment, because even previously we did not have enough hospital, especially in the rural areas of Afghanistan. But now, with the collapse of the previous government, there is no medicine, there is not enough healthcare workers, especially the female healthcare workers have stepped out of the hospitals. And at the same time that there is a pandemic going on, which is something that nobody cares about it, or nobody even have the chance to think about a pandemic going on in Afghanistan. So definitely lack of vaccine is another issue. Right to education is one of the things that the Afghan is a very fundamental human right, which the millions of girls in Afghanistan do not have access to it since 15 August, at least on the secondary school. So, and even those schools that have been opened in some provinces of Afghanistan is still, because of the food insecurity and because basically people are hungry, they don't go to school. I mean, these are the general things that human rights defenders are concerned about, and it's even these difficulties are even worse for the children with disabilities, because the situation is as dire and as difficult as nobody even thinks that how would it look for the children with disabilities. And one of the other things I'm really personally concerned about is that because I have been following the elimination of violence against women law in Afghanistan since 2017, and the EVO law was one of the biggest achievements of the Afghanistan women in the past 20 years. And now that law is gone. So Afghan women are losing a big support system, which could potentially result in more sexual abuse and more domestic violence cases. We have had reports that since the Taliban takeover, those cases who have been solved through the previous elimination of violence against women law have been dismissed. Basically arguing, the Taliban have argued that the law is not Islamic, and whatever that have been decided by the previous law is not valid. So, the concern, and it raises the concerns of more domestic violence cases, increased domestic violence cases in Afghanistan, because basically if something happens, there is no support system. The Taliban officials have publicly announced that women can go to the courts, but it's not practical, because there is no judge, there is no prosecutor or defense lawyer who will support women in domestic violence cases. We all know that the Taliban have a very narrow interpretation of Islam. So whatever they say, when they say that they are respecting the women's right according to the principles of Islam, the basic interpretation of these principles of Islam for Afghan women is more restrictions. So we don't think if they can provide any kind of legal protection for the victims of domestic violence.
Thank you, Farishta, for this very important overview. I have a specific question about forced marriage and early marriage and the recent Taliban decree on 3rd of December. But before that, I'd like to actually turn to Nicole, asking that in the context of what, Farishta, you have explained, and also how we know that the new rulers of Afghanistan, they're still struggling for international recognition and to prevent the country's economic collapse. We also know that the international organizations are calling for immediate humanitarian aid. Also, children are paying the heaviest of price in recent months of increased conflict and security. So, Nicole, my question to you is about some of ICRC's main operations in the country. How are these prioritizing children and in particular girls' protection in Afghanistan? Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks a lot, Bina. So from an ICRC perspective, and just to highlight, obviously, that we're very much guided by international humanitarian law, which only talks about the rights of children and not specifically about boys and girls. But I'll elaborate a bit more on our specific operations in Afghanistan, and where we certainly monitor also and ensure that we have a good understanding of how the conflict or the current situation has impacted women and children, so that we can also then adapt our programs accordingly. So I'm just going to highlight three of our main operations. One is related to health, where we have for many years already a substantial physical rehabilitation and many orthopedic centers in Afghanistan, where we treat women, boys, girls, men who either have been lost a limb or have been due to conflict or due to a misformation or disease. And then we also have strongly increased our primary health care services and our health response in Afghanistan since the 15th of August. And children do constitute about 40% of our patients in primary health care. And then we've also upskilled our nutritional response, knowing, as Farishta mentioned, that this is really of great concern. And it particularly affects children as well. So we've really scaled up our health response since August, and it will continue to be our main priority for the months to come. Then our second main priority is really in terms of protection and prevention. So it's the domain I oversee as well. And here we've really had a strong increase in terms of searching for and trying to reunite families who have been separated at the time of the evacuations led by different states, whether it's the US or NATO or Australia, New Zealand. And also because of people leaving the country, going to Pakistan or Iran or neighboring countries. And so that creates a lot of family separation. And so the ICRC, together with other UN or agencies, we're also trying to search for and reestablish the contact between children and their families or family members that have been separated. So that's a big activity that will take also quite some time to identify all these children and their families. And then we've also recently resumed our activities in places of detention, which unfortunately there are also children in detention, and we cater to their needs specifically, and we try to look at what their needs are. And then lastly, we have an activity called the protection of the civilian population, where we really look at the impact of the conflict on men and women, and also specifically on children, and where we try to raise our concerns with the concerned authorities, try to change their behaviors, and also ensure that they do adhere to international humanitarian law or to other international standards. And we also obviously coordinate with other entities, with the UN, being part of the, for example, the education clusters, or we try to coordinate because the needs are huge, and obviously there's enough to do for everyone. And then finally, the idea is also we work a lot on water and habitat, where we rehabilitate schools as well, and we also ensure that the civilian population have access to water and hygiene. But, and lastly, I want to join Fereshta also in what she mentioned, is that we really strongly advocate also to the international community, to donors, to resume their support and their funding to Afghanistan, so that we avoid a collapse of the system. So that's a bit in a nutshell what we do. It's just ramping up all our activities that we've been carrying out for years already, because we've been there for many years. Oh, back to you, Mina.
Thanks so much, Nicole, for this important overview of your operations in Afghanistan. 2 days ago, when we had the women's panel, I remember Faroujan mentioned that when she was young and she saw those ICRC logos in different parts of Afghanistan, how it always reminded her that that's protection and that's security. And that's very important, that when international organizations work in humanitarian contexts, how actually young people also look at them and think of protection and security in a very different way. So that was a really powerful anecdote. I wanted to come back to Fereshta Jan, to you with a follow-up question about forced marriages. Now, we know that even though marriage under the age of 15 is illegal nationwide, it has been commonly practiced for years, especially in many rural parts of Afghanistan. Now, on 3rd of December 2021, the Taliban has also issued a decree barring forced marriages in Afghanistan, saying that women, I quote, that women should not be considered property and must consent to marriage. But we also know that questions remain about whether the group that returned to power in mid-August would extend women's rights around work and education. So I guess marriage and work and education all are really related here. In terms of that, do you think from international community and also in other ways, the issue of forced marriage and early marriages, it's hyper visible, while other concerns are perhaps less visible? Or do you think this is one of the key issues for girls' rights in Afghanistan at the moment? Over to you, Fereshta.
So, I mean, if we put it very in a very basic example, there are different reasons. First of all, because that there have been restrictions have been put in terms of education and employment for women in Afghanistan. So when a girl cannot go to school, and even if they go to school, then they cannot work. Then the first thing that they will do in Afghanistan is to get married, because they need someone to support them. And if they cannot be financially independent, then the best second option is to get married. And in the southern and eastern Afghanistan, because women are not allowed to even go out of the house without a mahram or a male chaperone, then it would make it very easier for them if they have a husband to go with. And so for all of these different reasons, we expect that the number of the forced marriages, early marriages, child marriages will definitely increase. This is one of the things. The other aspect is that because there is not a support system, there is not a supportive system in place who can prevent all these, it will definitely result in increasing these cases. So previously, under the EVA law, we had special courts, we had special prosecution units, and even within the Ministry of Interior, we had a special family responses units. And I have been working on building the capacity of the justice staff for the past 7 years when I was in Afghanistan, and we were providing trainings for all of these special units to know how to treat with the victims of sexual violence, with the victims of domestic violence. And one of the capacities that we lost for the past 3 months is that we have lost all of those employees who could potentially support all of these victims. So, for example, just a week ago, I just saw in the news that the Taliban Administrative Justice they're just basically hiring their Talib members as employees for the Ministry of Justice, and they're not using the previous government employees, while the international community have been spending billions of dollars on building the capacity of those people. So one of the things I'm really doubting is that we know that the Taliban have taken over the country, but I doubt if they have the capacity to govern actually. We saw that the Taliban leader have issued a special decree on women's rights, and half of this decree speaks about the marriage. It doesn't talk about the right to education or right to employment at all. So the basic interpretation of this rule itself says that women are Taliban regard women as sex assets, and they're trying to control their bodies. And one of the other issues that we do have concerns and with the Taliban is that whenever something arises about the women's rights, they always publicly say that they respect women's rights according to principle of Islam, but we don't know which Islam they're referring to. There is not a single definition or an accurate definition of Islamic principles. For example, when they say that the forced marriage is not allowed, within a legal framework, everything needs to be defined. So we don't know what is for example, the age marriage for them. We don't know how do they define a forced marriage. And that's why I doubt if they have the capacity to govern, because the rule that have been issued is very vague and very general, and it's not practical on a legal framework. It's not practical in a legal system. It needs to be interpreted, and we don't know which Islamic principle, which interpretation of Islam. We know that they're an extremist group. We know that they are willing to put more restriction on women, but we don't know how, because we do not have any accurate definition on the Islamic principles. Afghanistan, even before 15 August, used to be the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. The Afghanistan constitution was based on the principles of Islam. All the regulations which were implementing in Afghanistan before was also Islamic, but the Taliban are not accepting any of those. So in that sense, we're expecting that, we don't expect Taliban to have a very supportive system in place for women, considering their background.
Well, thank you so much, Farishta, for this important observation, particularly what you say that in justice sector and in other sectors, now that so many are not able to go to work and and contribute, there's a big vacuum there. So that's obviously an important challenge, what we need to consider from various perspectives. Nicole, in that context, my question to you is about challenges. In Afghanistan, the ICRC focuses on monitoring the conduct of hostilities and working to prevent violations of international humanitarian law. It visits detainees and assisting civilians affected by the conflict. So in that context, what are some of the challenges now to work on children's and girls' protection issues in Afghanistan and also elsewhere? Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks a lot, Bina. I think one of the main challenges that we have across the board and including in Afghanistan is often access to affected communities, access to children, access to women who have been affected by conflict or other situations of violence. And this for security reasons, also because we have been targeted as a humanitarian organization, but also because of other challenges related to the environment, to weather conditions, to different challenges. And also we constantly have to put into the balance the do no harm principle in terms of a humanitarian organization visiting these people and the how it could be perceived by others and really the interests of these affected communities. So the challenges are always huge, and in Afghanistan these exist as well. But we obviously try to overcome these challenges and to be close to the affected communities wherever possible, and we're working hard on that in Afghanistan as well. And the challenges is really to have a voice for women and for children to be able to hear them also. Because, and we see it in perhaps not so much in Afghanistan, but in countries where children are born under the control, in areas under control of non-state armed groups, or in states in transition where children don't have a birth certificate and don't have an ID card, therefore, but that then just completely hampers their access to any essential services. They cannot be registered in school, they cannot get vaccinated. So it has a trickle-down effect for a large portion of their lives, actually. And then we also see that obviously women, girls and women have specific protection concerns related to sexual violence, as first I also mentioned, forced marriage, unwanted pregnancies, and then also the lack of access to appropriate healthcare, included to mental health care. Access to education is another one, forced recruitment by an armed group. So these are all sorts of challenges that we face in many of the countries that we work in, and we try to address them through our network of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, or through partnerships with other organizations as well. And as I mentioned previously as well, one of the big protection concerns that we see is really in terms of family separations due to climate change, due to migration, and also due to conflict, and where there we also really, the best protection is really to reunify these children with their family members. So those are some of the things we do, but and in Afghanistan, definitely the challenges are big, and again, it cannot just fall on humanitarian organizations. And so again, the appeal for everyone to return to Afghanistan, also to work there, but also things are still very much shifting in Afghanistan. And so also in the dialogue that we have with the concerned authorities, it's still it's still also shifting. It has to settle down. So there are some challenges there as well. That's it.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I have a general question to both of you about the importance of research in terms of the situation of women and girls. But before that, I wanted to request those in the audience, please think of questions. And if you have any specific question for our amazing speakers, you're welcome to type it on chat box, or you're welcome to ask that, and I will just unmute you if you'd like to ask any question. So Ferishta and Nicole, in our two-part conversation, we've attempted to draw attention to gender-sensitive and age-responsive concerns for women and girls in Afghanistan. Now, we realize that there have been plenty of conversations, particularly at this time of 16 days of activism. But in your view, from your work in Afghanistan, in Asia Pacific, and elsewhere in protection and human rights issues, how could academics and researchers contribute to knowledge about these concerns? What are some of the key sort of evidence and data gaps in your view that we should think about, particularly after mid-August, what's happening in Afghanistan? Over to you. Nicole, should we start with you this time and then we'll come to Farishta?
Thanks, Salant. No, definitely. I think there is a complementary role to play between academics and humanitarian organizations, for example, in the sense that academics can do a deep dive into a certain subjects, which can help us inform our operations and inform the response that we can give to a certain problem. So definitely, I think there's a lot of complementarity to be built upon, and we internally also within ICRC are now fostering more research. We recently created the core, which is a center for operational research, also within the ICRC, but we partner with other universities also. And so it's really to have a more in-depth analysis of some of their core issues or some of the emerging trends that we see. Some of the things that we focus on is exactly climate change and the effect of the compounded effect, for example, of climate change and conflict and the impact that has on affected populations. And so there are a lot of researches also ongoing for us to be able to better respond afterwards. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Farishta, wanted to ask for your response. Thank you.
I mean, researching and looking into what is actually happening to the women and girls in Afghanistan is the first step. Documenting of what is actually happening and then the acknowledgement of all of this violation is the first step for any advocacy efforts, which I think that the academia can really, help in this part, because we need to do more researches. We need to talk about what is happening and to raise the awareness about all of these violations. One of the questions that I have been asked in the past 3 months, every time I talk about all this violation in Afghanistan, is the first question that everybody is asking me, that what we are losing actually. Nobody knows that how Afghanistan looked like before the Taliban taking over. So I think a comparative study would be one of the things that would be very useful to understand that what is actually happening there. What we had and what we have now is the differences, and for example, we see all of these protests, and then we see that the Afghan women are still resisting. So I think it would be very important to highlight these changes and to acknowledge these violations on Afghan women would be very crucial for any advocacy efforts. And one of the things that we have been calling all international donor community in the past 3 months, and I think it's very important for whoever who takes any research initiatives on these issues, is that once we document and once we acknowledge and approve that such a thing is happening, then we have been calling on the international community to take the women's rights, especially the right to employment and right to education, as one of the biggest concerns on their agenda in building any kind of diplomatic relationships with the Taliban, which I think is very crucial, because we all know the Taliban are still looking for recognition, and in that sense, the international community has leverage over the government to make sure that women's rights is on the agenda, and to make sure that at least some red lines are going to be put in place.
Thank you so much, Farishta. From what you and Nicole mentioned, as an academic also, I distilled those and think that connecting, for example, with ICRC's operational research unit and others, and as from ANU, we work with ICRC And I know other universities also have close cooperation models and MOUs with the organization. So that's very important through those, sometimes informing humanitarian agencies of some of the research intensive questions and data gaps. And what you first mentioned is that advocacy and human rights, thinking about documenting, collecting evidence and testimony, and recognizing that political history, what's we are losing, what's been lost, to also document those is very, very important to go forward. And in both of these contexts, thinking about women's rights, that it shouldn't be actually overlooked, and we shouldn't just think about it at how that's being missed, but actually prioritizing actions and research with women on board. So these are very important sort of insights from both of you. We have questions for you in the chat box. And if you are interested to ask a question instead of typing, please let us know. We will unmute your microphone. I have a question for Nicole from my colleague, Farkondajan. So Faru asked, Nicole, to you, considering ICRC's role in Afghanistan, has the organization taken any initiative, particularly to negotiate girls' access to secondary schools? If so, is there any insight that you can share with us on what to expect ahead?
Thanks a lot for this question. Without wanting to go too much into the operational response, and yeah, as I mentioned before, we are working on rehabilitating schools in Afghanistan, and it is certainly a question that we have very high on our agenda in terms of access to schools, secondary schools or primary schools for Afghan girls all over the country. And it is something that we will try to tackle and to raise with the authorities in due time, because as I mentioned before, everything is still a bit in the making. We're still building also a relationship with the authorities. So yeah, but definitely it is something that we will take into account.
Thanks so much, Nicole. And if I could also add from UNICEF work in the country, I know that UNICEF representative and others who are working, they've been in operation. It's been not without its challenges, of course, but they have been working and trying to negotiate access to schools in the secondary school as well. So there are some conversations at the moment that's happening. So maybe, I don't know if Ferishta, you'd like to join in from Human Rights Watch, from your perspective, if rights-based institutions are also lobbying with the current government?
At Human Rights Watch, as a research and advocacy organization, we are committed to document about what is happening. We have been talking to the school teachers, to the students themselves. We have been talking to the partner organizations all over the country. And I'm aware that my colleagues at the moment are also collecting data on how these schools operate, especially in the provinces that have been claimed that the schools are open for the girls. So for example, Ghazni, Bamyan, because we really want to know that, what does it mean? We know that the schools have opened in some provinces partially, but we don't know whether if there is enough teacher, if there is enough training materials. We don't know if the students are still going to school. We have reports that the Taliban have changed the curriculum in some provinces of Afghanistan, and they have included more Islamic material to the school curriculum, but we don't know what exactly those things are. So we have an ongoing research on the girls' right to education, and I can say that we have a very comprehensive report coming out in the next few weeks on this issue, and we will continue advocate and document this issue.
Thank you, Farishta. There's a question from Anonymous to both of you. If you have any observation about boys and young men, their protection in Afghanistan. So I don't know if either of you would like to respond to it.
So I will step in. I have been working on a project when I was in Afghanistan on the conflict-related sexual abuse of men and boys in Afghanistan. We were, it was obviously before the Taliban takeover, and even though under the previous government we had very little support for the boys, we had the Elimination of Violence Against Women law, which was only covering girls. And for the boys, we had very little support. Before working on this research project, I was always thinking that women in Afghanistan are the most vulnerable community there. But after doing this research, I just got to know that the LGBT, especially the LGBT community, is the most vulnerable community in Afghanistan, and they're really living in a difficult situation. They had an underground life and almost no public presence. So, I was working on this report in 2019, and I know some of the challenges that were still there. We knew that the sexual abuse against boys, especially the underage boys, the child laborers, the children in military was one of the concerns in that time. But I cannot even imagine how would it look like at the moment. I can confirm that there is no support system in place. The whole country is in a chaos at the moment. We know there is no legal system at all. I don't think if the justice system and the courts and everything are really smoothly operating at the moment, but looking forward, I think definitely it's going to be very tough and very difficult for the boys as well. And sexual abuse was something that would definitely happen, especially in the southern province of Afghanistan, because I have traveled to those provinces and I have documented these cases under the previous government, which we still had very little articles included in the penal code who was criminalizing the sexual abuse against underage boys. But now, with all of those laws gone and with all of those supportive system gone, it should definitely be worse.
Thank you very much, Farishta. Nicole, do you have anything to add, or should I ask the second question? Over to you.
No, I think Farishta covered it, this first question.
No problem. Thank you. We have two questions from Dr. Srinjoy Bose. Srinjoy, do you want to just ask them? Should I turn on the mic for you?
Yeah, thank you, Pina.
Yeah.
That'd be great, just because
yeah,
over time is just a question for the panelists. This might be outside your remit, but I'd like to understand a little bit more about how international organizations are actually working with Afghan civil society organizations on the ground in terms of both shaping and delivering assistance. From my point of view, this is something that the international community has failed to learn from past efforts. They've tried to build institutions to provide aid rather than working with civil society organizations on the ground. They failed to leverage the strength of Afghan civil society organizations. I'm wondering, given that these civil society organizations are operating under immense stress at the moment, what efforts are being made to work with them? What's the possibility of working with them going forward? I'll limit my question to just that one question.
Thank you, Srinjoy. Nicole, may I pass the mic over to you first? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Definitely, the ICRC really tries to work in as much as possible with the civil society in Afghanistan or in any other country where we work in. The idea is really to exchange information, to have a better understanding also of the issues they are working on, to get a better understanding, a more in-depth also understanding through these exchanges and through this coordination together. In Afghanistan particularly, I think we're also in the process of redoing a little bit of a stakeholder mapping, of identifying who's still working, how the change of government has affected the civil society and all the other organizations working in Afghanistan, because some had to stop their activities, some are, in transitioning also, or so it's in the making. But we always try to coordinate or to partner with in as much as possible, also with other actors on the ground, and to really make sure that we don't duplicate our efforts and that we cover as much ground as possible together rather than individually. So, but yeah, so long answer short is that that we really try to work, especially when it comes, for example, to our protection of the civilian population activities, where we coordinate with the civil society, but also on our detention activities with lawyers, with others. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Nicole. First, I was just wondering, because you also mentioned previously of collecting evidence, collecting testimonies, and how Human Rights Watch is working with local civil society organizations, as Srinjoy asked. Over to you.
So in terms of the civil society organizations, most of the civil rights activists have fled the country, and those who are still in the country are living in hiding. So I would say that most of the civil society organizations are either not operating at all, or they have minimized their operations. Here in London, I'm working with an organization called the British and Irish Agencies Group for Afghanistan. And we, within the BOG, we have a meeting every week. It's called we have established a committee under the previous government, the Civil Society Working Committee. Previously, we were really advocating, trying to strengthen the civil society, because we were trying to promote the civil society role as a monitor, especially on the development projects and the governmental projects in that time. But now with the Taliban taking over, we have still continued having these meetings every week. I know that some of these organizations that still continue to operate are not operating from Afghanistan. Some of our colleagues have been evacuated to Ireland and to Albania. So some of these organizations have opened their organizations in exile. And one of the things that we are really looking into is to see that if these organizations can operate outside Afghanistan. I know that other options have been looking into, so if especially in the neighboring countries. So I know that the Civil Society Working Committee have been trying to see if they can open their offices either in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or the neighboring countries within Afghanistan. And one of the things that we are trying to come up with these days is, I'm having a meeting just in an hour or so. I'm aware that the World Bank has hired a consultant on doing a mapping on how we can go forward with the civil society, and how the international community can help them in the future. So these issues are in the consultations, and we are talking to the civil society organization and activists to see that how we can support them in Afghanistan and those who have got out abroad.
Thank you so much, Farishta. It's really interesting to hear that in other countries, how civil society is trying to create those networks and trying to establish different kinds of bases through which they could offer support. As we know, in terms of, for example, Burma, Myanmar, another country in our region, on the Thai-Burma border, there had been very active, vibrant civil society groups, human rights organizations, and refugee rights organizations from Burma, Myanmar, who were operating there in Chiang Mai, Mae Sot, in other areas. So what you say that, interestingly, how, and also India, for example, for a long, long time have housed different civil society groups in the country from neighboring countries. So I have one general question to both of you, if you would like to answer. I'm not sure. Bill Richardson have asked, he has asked that if there's much evidence of positive input from other nation states. So in terms of other states who are providing or offering support for girls' protection or women's rights issues in the country, or is it primarily from humanitarian and aid agencies? Either of you would like to respond to that?
I thought Nicole might be in a best position to answer the question.
Well, Nicole, you think about this, and no pressure in terms of responding. But in terms of, if I may add a little bit here, that we do know that in August and before the cutoff date, that many of us who work in Australia and elsewhere in academic networks and activist networks who have friends in Afghanistan have very quickly started lobbying and working with and trying to help our friends and colleagues and research collaborators come out of the country. And some of those, in those situations, it also required a very significant kind of networking with government agencies. So working from visa and immigration and other things, and trying to really raise awareness in different kinds of ministries. And I know that many here who are joining me, they also know from South Asia, from Australia, the UK, in the United States, there have been very strong kind of activism and connection with actually government ministries, line ministries, with academics. So this is something I can give as an example. I'm not sure, Nicole, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
Not particularly, actually. I think it's a bit of a sensitive issue for us to comment on. Just to reiterate that our main focus on this is really the family reunification and maintaining family contacts of people who have been separated, and that's really our approach on this.
Thank you very much. And as we might appreciate that sometimes working on the ground means, and having access on the ground means that not everything could be publicly expressed and talked about, but organizations who are working there, ICRC, UNICEF and others, we know that these organizations take immense risks. And there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes. So I'm sure everyone is very grateful for that. And we really appreciate Nicole and Ferishta for your incredible insights. And I know that it's really, really early in the morning for both of you. I hope now you have some time for a nice coffee break. And those of you who are joining us from Australia, a very good evening to you. Thank you for listening in. And I think we are just about finished now. Thanks so much. Good evening. Bye.